Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us. It's really encouraging to see everybody in the room with us, and really excited just to get started. Now, before we begin, I did want to give a brief content warning. Just by virtue of the topic of what we're talking about today, we will be discussing racial violence as well as anti-Asian attacks and may show triggering images. So wanted to flag that for folks. As always, please prioritize your own well-being and care. If at any point you need to step away, take a short break, anything like that, it is completely understood and encouraged. Now, Ariana, if you don't mind pulling up the poll, to kick things off, we wanted to provide a little bit of interaction and just also see there's so many people in this virtual room with us. Who is here with us? What have your experiences been, both in your community or at school? And how have folks been dealing with the rise in anti-Asian attacks that have been so prominent in the media?
So the first question is, have you personally witnessed or heard of an anti-Asian incident in your school or environment? On a scale of 1 to 5, how equipped do you feel to address anti-Asian racism in your classroom? You can elaborate in the chat. And what actions has your school taken in response to anti-Asian racism? Check all the boxes that apply.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for participating. If you like, you can elaborate on your answers in the chat. Just to give a quick overview of the results, because I know they were flashed up very quickly, it seems that the majority of people maybe have not personally witnessed an incident at their school, but have witnessed or heard from others in their community that anti-Asian incidents have happened in their community space. That the majority of people feel somewhat equipped to deal with anti-Asian incidents in school. Nobody, unfortunately, feels like an expert. And then finally, the last question, whether schools have done anything concrete to address anti-Asian racism. Unfortunately, it appears that the majority have said that their school has taken no action. And I'm so sorry, I'm seeing in the chat that some attendees weren't able to fill out the polls before they were taken away. If you like, please share in the chat what your responses would have been, just so that we can get a sense from the community. I see more people are saying school has not provided information, that maybe there have been anti-bullying procedures provided, but nothing specifically targeting the spike in anti-Asian incidents during the pandemic. Now, thank you all for participating in the poll. I think what we have heard from all of you is not surprising, but certainly rather disheartening. And so what we will be doing during this presentation today is walking through a little bit of what the context is, building off of what Professor Watanabe talked about in his presentation, and also provide some concrete resources for you as educators and for you to provide to your parents, to other members of your school community who may be struggling with anti-Asian incidents during this time period. Now, moving along, just to give a few numbers, I know Professor Watanabe already gave a very moving overview over what we've been seeing right now. But to give some numbers, just to add a little bit of meat to what is happening. Obviously, I think everybody in the room knows that hate crimes against Asian Americans have seen a particularly steep spike during the COVID-19 pandemic, following the rise in inflammatory rhetoric, scapegoating the Asian community for the coronavirus. You can see nationwide, over 6,600 reports of anti-Asian discrimination were collected by a coalition of AAPI nonprofits nationwide since March 2020. And looking more at the population in general, looking at Asian Americans, almost half report experiencing one of 5 specific offensive incidents relating to the coronavirus pandemic, including being told to go back to their home country, correctly attributed or not, noticing people acting uncomfortable when they're in close proximity to you, or just being outright blamed for the coronavirus. And this was a Pew Research Center survey conducted in 2021. And I think these numbers might be surprising to some folks. especially people who might not be part of the affected communities, which is also something that is very much expected from survey results. Polling shows that significantly more Asians perceive a substantial uptick in anti-Asian violence versus when you poll non-Asians. For example, according to the Pew survey, over 80%, so the vast majority of polled Asian Americans say that violence against them is increasing. But then when you pivot to the general American adult population, that number jumps to just over half that feel the same increase in violence. And I also want to point out that these numbers, although already I think very alarming, are almost certainly an undercount. A lot of victims are reluctant to report what happened or don't know who to report it to. I have not used any data from police sources, as you may have noted, because higher numbers are collected from non-police sources. I think a lot of people are reluctant to get the police involved, particularly in communities of color. And so what you see are really nonprofits doing the legwork, taking to the streets and trying to pull people and see what is actually going on. Now, this is really personal, I think, for a lot of us in the education space. And many of you might be here today because you know that the numbers that I have up on the screen have direct and real life consequences for the Asian American students and families that we work with. In a 2020 survey, which is actually conducted by students, so peers surveying their peers, they found that 1 in 4 Asian American students reported experiencing racialized bullying during the pandemic, being targeted because they were Asian. And families can feel this, even if they might not know the exact numbers. Professor Watanabe alluded to this in his presentation, but in many cities across the United States, far smaller numbers of Asian American families are choosing to send their children back to in-person learning compared to, for example, white families. And even with parents who are choosing to send their children back to in-person learning, many of them have serious safety concerns, even if they are not vocalizing them. So we're going to talk through all of this today and give you some tools to support your students during these difficult times, but also some specific resources that will help equip parents and families in your school community. I think schools can be such an important community hub for spreading this kind of important information, particularly for parents who might not have access to established nonprofit infrastructures and who might be struggling with how to even talk about, let alone handle and move forward in the face of all of these anti-Asian attacks that are being blasted across the media, social media, things that our children are viewing on a daily basis. Now, I had here a section on myths and stereotypes targeting the Asian American population. I know that Professor Watanabe already gave a very good overview of these stereotypes, so I'm going to keep it really brief. Of course, we have the perpetual foreigner stereotype, this idea that Asians can never assimilate to become American. And this is a stereotype that is rooted in centuries of often very violent, exploitative, and bloody history. It's rooted in Asian exclusion, as Professor Watanabe talked about. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act is the first major federal piece of immigration legislation that was passed by the US government. And so if you kind of take a step back and think about the US immigration system, this is a topic that I get kind of fired up about as an immigration attorney. You'll see that we have such a developed immigration system now, right? And one that is particularly focused on restriction and enforcement. But this system didn't always exist. And it is one that is fundamentally premised on the original 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first attempt by the US federal government to restrict immigration in any kind of major way. And you can see that throughout history, following the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the movement to exclude Chinese during that time period, the anti-Chinese movement, spawned more and more movements against other groups of Asian immigrants, leading to movements against Korean migration, Japanese migration, Filipino migration, South Asian migration, and really just snowballing until you see complete Asian exclusion by the early 1900s. Now, All of this, I think, is very clear in terms of how it is linked to the coronavirus pandemic. During these types of national crises, it's very easy for the population to look for outsiders to blame for what is going on. And because Asian Americans have been associated with this perpetual foreigner label, because we are seen as non-American and as outsiders, regardless of how good our English is, right, or where we were born, we become extremely easy scapegoat targets, especially for politicians who might be trying to score points, right? Or be trying to explain why the pandemic is continuing unabated. Now, the second stereotype, which I will go over very briefly, is the model minority myth. This is a newer stereotype that really took root post-World War II with this whiz kid phenomenon that was publicized in various magazines and newspapers, and something that does have, I would say, a kernel of truth precisely because of how US immigration policy was being shaped at that time. Post-1965, immigrants were largely being admitted based on US employment needs for positions in tech, in medicine, positions that were higher paid, right, and required higher levels of education. As Professor Watanabe says, this myth is extremely problematic because it has been a powerful weapon used against other communities of color. But I also want to take a moment to talk about what this has meant for the Asian American population. This myth assumes that all Asian Americans are successful, right, are doing just fine. And it erases so much internal diversity, and it results in concrete funding disparities. If you look at places that collect this kind of data, you'll find that oftentimes states allocate social services, education, any type of supportive funding to Asian American communities at far lower rates than the proportion that they actually represent in the state population, tied to this idea that Asian Americans simply don't need funding. And this is something that I think is maybe easier to point out because it's money, it's numbers, you can look at it, you can trace it back. But it also is extremely powerful in terms of the invisibilization of attention. So what I mean by that is oftentimes when Asian students are being bullied, especially I would say before the coronavirus pandemic, before things became so visible, these incidents were often swept under the rug because I think there's a prevailing idea that you can't be racist against the minority that is doing well. And so it really helps to kind of break down where all of these ideas, these prejudices are coming from and understand why they hold so much power because they've been shaped and entrenched over these decades. So all of this clearly leads to a lot of problematic behavior and a lot of racialized incidents that cause racial trauma. So I have this definition of racial trauma up here. I'd love for everyone to just read it silently and then share in the chat what incidents might cause racial trauma, any examples that you can think of, and what effects they might have on somebody's physical or mental health. And I will also type that into the chat so everybody has it. I see someone noting George Floyd, certainly an incident that caused massive racial trauma across a very, very large scale. I see being stereotyped, assaulted, violence in the community, right? I think this is particularly important, including violence that is not targeted at yourself, but simply seeing the violence or hearing about the violence can also cause trauma. Being denied access to education, to important positions, callback rates. And I see one person noting specifically that it leads to PTSD, right? It leads to fear. This is extremely important and is something that you are predicting my next slide, taken directly from the DSM criteria for PTSD. All of these incidents, even small ones, even ones that we might brush aside in daily life, they have a cumulative effect. And it leads to many of these mental health symptoms. And I want to point out specifically with regards to identity-based bullying. This oftentimes leads to internalized oppression or racism. So our children and students being bombarded with these ideas about themselves, suffering this kind of harassment, slowly incorporating that into their own sense of self and beginning to believe the negative ideas that they hear about their own racial identity. And this is incredibly dangerous for something that is so central to our identity and something that we can't change. Now, dealing with racial trauma is a huge topic, right? And a very complex one. And I think it's something that maybe educators sometimes feel unequipped to handle because it might not be strictly within our training. But in times like these, knowing what our students are going through, it's extremely important to find trauma-informed strategies for helping our students process these incidents in a healthy way to combat this type of internalized oppression or racism trend that oftentimes does occur when our students don't get the support they need to help them handle what they are experiencing. So I have up here a 4-part process that the Immigrant History Initiative developed in partnership with an expert on racial trauma and psychology, Dr. Jenny Wang. And this process is part of a guide that is originally directed towards parents rather than educators, but I think is also very helpful for educators in thinking about how to help your students process and respond to racialized incidents that are happening at school. So step 1, emotional and physical regulation. After an incident, emotions are oftentimes still running high. And so it's important to bring the student into a safe space, a private space with a trusted adult to help them begin to regulate their emotions once more. And this process is really just about helping them through their emotions, about being a human with your student, helping them identify their physical and emotional reactions and guiding them in calming back down and coming back to center. Oftentimes we find it can be helpful to locate where on your body actually that you're feeling the stress or the anxiety, whether it's in the tightness of your chest or your throat, or maybe pain deep in your stomach. Sometimes these physical symptoms can be easier to articulate for our children rather than needing to articulate complex emotions that are being triggered by what happened to them. And then afterwards, practicing grounding exercises with the child. And this can span the gamut from journaling, listening to music, doing some deep breathing, etc. Basically any kind of activity that helps ground the student and bring them back to an emotional center. And I would encourage everyone to take as much time as they need for this kind of regulation process. Step 2 is labeled investigation, which is, I think, a very loaded term, maybe in the school space, and not what we intended when we were writing this guide for parents. What we mean by investigation is more of a collaborative process with the student to try to figure out what happened. It's absolutely not an interrogation. It should be done only after the child has calmed back down, after step 1 is complete. And if they're not ready to talk, don't force them to talk. You can wait for a different time, even a different day. And this step should be approached in a non-judgmental and curious way, where you and the student are working together almost as detectives to try to understand what happened. So you should be asking a lot of open-ended questions, and you should also be following the child's lead in terms of emotional intensity. It's important to try to still yourself, to not react too strongly, even if maybe the incident was really awful and you yourself are personally triggered and upset by what happened. Oftentimes, when the adult is more upset than the child is, the child will feel a sense of pressure and obligation to reassure the adult and minimize their own emotions, even though the focus should be on the child at this point. And going on to step 3, problem solving. We like to really highlight this because I think oftentimes conversations end at step 2. Once people figure out what happened, they just kind of move forward in thinking about what to do, and the child is somewhat left out of that process. And so in this problem-solving stage, we don't want the child to end on a note of helplessness or powerlessness, feeling like their agency has been taken away. So this step is about supporting the student as they think for options of how to move forward or potentially how to act the next time something like a racist incident occurs. And it's important also to let the student take the lead as much as possible and have as much decision-making power as is practicable under the circumstances, so that they feel like they still have their agency and that they still have a say in what is going to happen based on what they have personally experienced. And then finally, step 4, practice. This is a step that might be a little bit better suited for parents to practice with their children at home. What this step is about is really acknowledging the fact that in the moment of a racialized incident, your body is stressed out. It's probably going into fight, flight, or freeze mode. Your mind is probably going blank. And so it's much easier for children to remember and do what they brainstormed about doing during step 3 if they have an opportunity to practice beforehand in a safe space with an adult. Now, I know our time is coming to an end. I want also to just take a quick moment to talk about vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is a term that many of you might already be familiar with. It's the idea that particularly service providers can also experience the effects of trauma simply by being exposed to other people's trauma. And so it's really important here not to forget about your own care. As we mentioned in step 2, we don't encourage people to process their emotions at the same time that the child is processing, because at that time the focus should be on the child. But it's incredibly important to set aside time afterward for yourself. Racial trauma is racial trauma, regardless of your age. And I found that many adults, including myself, have not cracked the code for how to process racial trauma in a healthy way. And so it's really important to keep a sense of how this is affecting yourself as well, and take that time to process with somebody else, with a trusted confidant or with a therapist. Because oftentimes adults might even feel more upset by the incident because we have a lifetime of other events that might be getting triggered by this. And also because we might have a deeper understanding of the exact implications of whatever racist statement or action occurred. Now, I'm going to hand it off to Julia to talk a little bit more about the concrete resources that IHI has on our website.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you all for being here today. I know we just went through like a whirlwind kind of presentation on this resource, but we have a parent guide available on our website called Talking to Kids about Asian American Identity and Racism. And this guide will provide not only the 4-step process that Kathy just went through, as well as some suggestions for, specific scripts, specific conversation guides to, talking about racialized incidents, but it will also have a brief kind of Asian American history, including some of the things that Professor Watanabe and Kathy talked about today, as well as some tips for advocating at your school, which is more applicable for parents. I think it also, kind of provides ways in which parents might come to educators about racialized bullying incident or something related to that. So, please share with your parents. It's completely sort of available on our website. It's available in 7 languages, including Chinese, Vietnamese, Hindi, Tagalog, and Nepali, as well as Korean. And so, if you have parents who are maybe English learners, they can also access the in-language resource. In addition to this parent guide, we have a couple of other IHI resources that are available on our website to help facilitate, meaningful discussion and engagement around COVID-19 and anti-Asian racism. Please go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the lesson plans we have for download on our website is called Empathy During COVID. And this guide really centers restorative justice principles and helps educators kind of use those principles to guide their students through reflections on the cause of anti-Asian racism. So for a lot of you who sort of mentioned in chat, that you've already seen microaggressions sort of occur either in the classroom or kind of around it. This guide kind of helps educators sort of set the scene, and have a full classroom discussion. And we have an agenda basically for a restorative justice circle that you can kind of take as a lesson in your classroom. And just a quick note for those of you who might not be familiar with RJ, it's sort of in contrast to traditional student discipline, and it allows communities and schools, right, to reflect collectively on the harms that have been created by problematic behavior and find ways to move forward as a community and as a group. And so in addition, this resource also has some pre and post homework, including the video that you watched today, as well as some additional resources for those who are, wanting to get more background information on RJ, as well as on the history of anti-Asian violence and racism. And the final resource I'll just mention again on our website is a set of lesson plans that are using historical case studies to engage students in thinking about the implications of racism today during the current pandemic. And the first lesson we have is available and ready on our website, and it looks at the smallpox epidemic in San Francisco in the 1800s and the subsequent scapegoating of the Chinese community there. And later in the summer, we'll have another lesson on the rise in anti-Semitism during the New York City cholera epidemic in the late 1800s. And these resources are really meant probably most suited for language arts or history or social studies classrooms, but it allows students to kind of use this historical case study to engage in some critical thinking about, the connection between racism and xenophobia and public health. And specifically, the first lesson plan has 3 classroom activities where students will analyze historical resources, political cartoons, as well as contemporary artwork about COVID to really think critically about the current moment. And then with a final note, IHI does provide PD workshops, as well as sort of workshops with parents and educators on issues of anti-Asian racism and violence and how to better equip schools and parents for, supporting their children. And so, definitely get in touch with us if you are interested. And here are the links where you can also find us. And with that, I think we'll conclude our presentation. Thank you all so much for listening.